and welcome to the Religion and Popular Culture podcast, where we talk about religion, popular culture, and everything in between. I am your resident anthropologist of religion, Vivian Asimos, and I am joined by the sociologist of religion, a very good friend of mine, Aled Thomas. How are you, Aled?
I'm well, thank you. It's quite good that you introduced me as a sociologist of religion in this one, because I think the conversation we're having today is going to particularly draw from the sociology of religions in particular.
I figured also I should maybe occasionally plug the fact that we do have credentials.
Allegedly. We've somehow managed to convince places that we know what we're talking about.
You know, in some people's minds, we are somewhat of experts.
Indeed. Indeed.
Well, today we're going to be talking about, it's a bit complicated. We're talking about cults. But I think that I'm using a particular example from popular culture, which is drawn from a Real Housewife of Salt Lake City, which is a reality TV show. We're going to be talking about Mary Cosby, who runs a church that has some claims against it that it is a cult. And I think this is a really interesting kind of case study to bring forward for the discussion about cults. Pop culture in general, I think, is really fascinated by the conversation around cults. What is a cult? Avoiding cults, all of that kind of stuff. There's so much of it that we could probably use all sorts of different examples. But I think this one's particularly interesting because people seem to be rather split on the conversation. So it makes it a really interesting one to have as far as what makes something a cult, or, is anything a cult? We can kind of have that discussion. And Aled's a bit more of the expert on it. So I think it'd be interesting to have those kinds of conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note right from the start that we're using the word cult in inverted commas.
Yes.
Because as we'll see when we unpack the Real Housewives case study for today, that it's very much a loaded term and comes with an enormous level of connotations with various characteristics, which of course we as academics avoid trying to create these sweeping judgments. So yeah, from the start, just making it clear to everyone that we are not using the term as a value judgment on our part. We are just looking at the phenomenon of cultic discourse, shall we say.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that the conversation around cults in popular culture and the way that the word is used often is somewhat different than the way the word religion, and they seem to always be almost like separate conversations. And I think that's the thing that we're going to kind of dig into, is also that kind of that differentiation that society kind of puts on different religious groups that make them inherently different and othered, but we'll get into it. But we should probably start by giving a little bit of context to the case study that we're presenting. And I am very aware that I am probably, I like Real Housewives and I like reality television, but I'm under no qualms that everyone listening to this is equally as obsessed as I am. So I figured I would give a little bit of a background on the franchise and what we're talking about and who we're talking about, but then also explain a little bit about what we know of the church and how it's in the context of the show. So how it's being presented to us as viewers, but then how that has shifted through the viewing of it off camera as well. And then I think that will help us kind of get into the more complicated conversations. So we're talking about Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, which is part of the Real Housewives franchise. It started with Real Housewives of Orange County, which was kind of playing off of the Desperate Housewives TV show. And it really grew into lots of different, there's mostly in the US, but there are some outside of the US. For example, Real Housewives of Melbourne is a really good franchise for people who are after it. There's I think one or two here in the UK that I don't think have quite gotten to quite the extent of some of the American ones. New York is quite big. Salt Lake City is the most recent of the kind of main franchises. And Salt Lake City is a really interesting place to position it, at least for our purposes of this podcast, because the conversation around religion is more heavily present in this franchise than in any of the other ones, primarily because of its positioning in Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City is a heavily Mormon, historically Mormon and culturally Mormon city. But there's obviously not only Mormons there, and so the conversation around who is Mormon, who is not Mormon, what those other religions are, is very present throughout the whole show, which made it really fascinating for me personally to watch, and that is my excuse, and I'm sticking with it.
Yep. Own it.
Yeah, so it is very new. It first aired November of 2020. The production went through quite a bit of an issue, so it's really great in the fact that it drops you in right in the middle of the drama, but it also sometimes feels very disjointed, and this happens a lot when it comes to our primary character of Mary Cosby. She was supposed to be just a friend of, so she was supposed to be just kind of around, but not really a main cast member. So a lot of her scenes feel very separate from everyone else a lot of the times because they were very added in later. But she is a very interesting character, and so they brought her on. There's a lot of different characters. So there's Lisa Barlow, who is a Mormon, but she runs a liquor company, and alcohol is not very seen as good to be consuming for a lot of Mormons. So that is a lot of conversation about what it means to be Mormon while running a liquor company. You have Heather Gay and Whitney Rose, who are both more ostracized Mormons, and they're trying to find their place of whether or not they want to stick to Mormonism, whether or not they want to leave. Both of them were ostracized from the church following a divorce. Whitney had an affair while she was married, so that is extra bad for the Mormon church, while Heather just got a divorce. Both of them are seen as kind of ostracized from the church because of these. Jen Shaw is an ex-Mormon who converted to Islam, primarily because she discovered how racist a lot of Mormonism is, at least historically speaking, and she married a black man. So, she kind of learned about a lot of this. She's also a woman of color herself, so kind of discovering a lot of this stuff was a struggle for her. She converted to Islam. Jen Shaw also has a lot of her own problems when it comes to the law, as she was just recently arrested on federal charges of fraud. But that's, I think, a whole nother conversation for a whole nother day. But then you have Meredith, who is Jewish, and then Mary Cosby, who's our focus of today, who is a Pentecostal church leader. Mm-hmm. So she's kind of the Christian of the group, and she's a Pentecostal Christian. So for people who are a little bit less aware, people who kind of think of speaking in tongues, who get very excited, the kind of Christians that you think of as dancing around and standing up and feeling the spirit in them is what you think of when it comes to Pentecostal. Somewhat broadly speaking, but I think that's a really good summary if you don't really know what Pentecostal religion really looks like. So I mention all of this in order to kind of give you an idea of the type of franchise that you're talking about. So religion comes up a lot, and there's a lot of scenes also in Mary's church. Mary runs the church. So she calls herself the First Lady because she thinks a pastor sounds like she should be old. So she likes to be called the First Lady because she likes to think of herself as being very young. She took over the church from her grandmother, who was the one who founded it. Her grandmother was really loved by everyone, and then her grandmother passed away under questionable circumstances, and she then Mary married her grandmother's husband. So she is married to her step-grandfather. And she supposedly married him because that meant that she was able to then take on all of her grandmother's assets, including the running of the church. So there's obviously a lot of really interesting facets to Mary. And if you're interested in the more legal side of everything that went on, because there was a lot of legal issues surrounding her step-grandfather and the marriage and what was going on with it, and the shadiness of the grandmother's death. There's another podcast called The Bravo Docket, where it's two lawyers who break down a lot of the legal issues on shows on Bravo, like The Real Housewives. They did a really good deep dive on Mary Cosby and her whole family and what was going on there. And I highly suggest it because I am not a lawyer and I don't know what I'm talking about. Because today we're going to focus more on what I do know what I'm talking about, which is religion.
Indeed.
And what was really interesting was that before the show started airing, there was a little bit of chatter on the fact that Mary Cosby had married her step-grandfather and that she ran this Pentecostal church, and it seemed a bit weird, and she seemed a bit weird. That conversation ended up going more towards the fact that this church might be a cult. And then over the airing of the first season, the cult claims came to be much more present in the conversation online. It was really hard to kind of go online and talk about Real Housewives of Salt Lake City without running into the conversation about whether or not she was running a cult. There have been a couple of journalistic deep dives, but most of the information that they've received have been online because obviously this was during a pandemic. So the veracity of these things are also very questionable. So I don't want to land on one side or the other as far as the claims being true or not. But the idea of whether or not this is a cult is going to become a storyline in the upcoming season. I saw the kind of hint at it in the season 2 trailer, which is going to be airing probably around the time this episode comes out. So I'm excited to be seeing how they handle the conversation of the cult. But I think it'll be interesting prior to have a conversation a little bit more from the anthropology and the sociology of religion side of it. So, Alan, you deal with new religious movements quite a lot in your work. Mm-hmm. So what do typically people think of when we're saying the word cult, and when would a sociologist potentially use the word?
Right. So the word cult has, in terms of academic discourse, we tend to just avoid it altogether. It's just become too problematic because of these associations it has in the public domain. It is commonly associated with usually a single charismatic leader, which in this example, the conversation is about Mary Cosby, who plays that part of the charismatic leader. And new religions do have charismatic leaders, yes, but the way they are presented in terms of cults is that they are charismatic, but ultimately they have ulterior motives, and they're often presented as being fraudulent or maybe abusive. And another common typology with this understanding of a cult in the public domain is the idea of brainwashing, that followers are ultimately mindless in that they have been coerced into believing a set of beliefs that the wider public may see as bizarre, or beliefs that are ultimately harmful to them, whether that is physically, mentally, or financially. Now, it's important to just say off the bat here that the brainwashing thesis has been debunked in academic debate. There isn't significant evidence to suggest that brainwashing is a phenomenon that truly exists. Often, I find that accusations of brainwashing tend to come down to a lack of understanding of the lived reality of the individual that is being accused of being brainwashed. And I think this comes into the conversations that we've had on this podcast in the past about terms like primitive and older religions or non-Western religions that are seen as being less developed. Often this simply comes down to a normative understanding of what religion is from a Western perspective, and religions that don't fit that category are therefore seen as other and are treated in a very different way. When the Second World War finished, there was a boom of new religions and alternative religions, which led to a moral panic in society regarding cults, particularly in the 1970s and the 1980s. And there were examples of destructive movements such as Jonestown, where tragic events led to an understanding of a cult as being something incredibly destructive, and that then was applied to a whole host of movements, simply because they were new. And this is where the problematic aspect comes in: is that the the events of Jonestown then had an impact on how other new religions that weren't harmful were presented in wider debate. So that's why we tend to avoid the word cult, because what an individual's everyday life is like can be completely different to that mindset. And I'll say as well that often I tend to avoid the term new religion, and I'll simply use the word religion, because that is what we're dealing with here. And in a sense, every religion is new in the way that when new generations emerge and people are born, they have different ways of understanding and doing this religion. So what, say, Christianity looks like now is very different to what Christianity looked like 1,000 years ago. In that sense, contemporary Christianity is a new religion. It's constantly fluid, it's constantly developing. So I have some problems with the term new and what new entails anyway. And I'm doing some work with Ed Graham Hyde at the moment about how this world religions paradigm, which of course is so detrimental to the study of religions, has been extremely detrimental for new religions, because it's created that barrier between so-called traditional proper religion and then the other ones.
Yeah.
It's created that binary, which I think is very problematic. I appreciate I'm really going to town here. But what's instantly struck me about the Mary Cosby aspect, you were saying that there's discourse surrounding whether it's a cult or not. And you said that generally speaking, there are two sides that people seem divided.
Yeah.
I've got a theory as to why. I'd be interested to know in which ways are they divided.
Hit me with your theory.
Well, if she's a Pentecostal church leader, this means that Mary Cosby is essentially part of a movement that Roy Wallace would describe as a world accommodating movement. So Roy Wallace, the sociologist of new religions, divided new religions into three categories: world rejecting, world accommodating, and world affirming. And world rejecting are the movements that tend to push away mainstream society and mainstream lifestyles, and become where the people practicing in these groups tend to interact with only with one another. They don't tend to have regular jobs, say. And Mary Cosby's Pentecostal church would fall under the category of world accommodating. Now, a world accommodating religion tends to be an offshoot of a pre-existing religion, in this case Christianity, or a different understanding of Christianity. So while it is seen as different or other, in the sense that it has the speaking in tongues that you were referring to just now, that may separate it from other forms of Christianity, at the same time, it is still a form of religion that people can grasp. It is still essentially Christianity, even if it's a different type of it. And it's a world accommodating religion in the sense that people who belong to to Cosby's church can practice in this church, they can attend the services, but they still have a life outside of it, in the sense that they may have regular everyday jobs. It's a form of religion that fits into their current lives. So they still take part in mainstream society. They don't reject the norms of mainstream society, but they do still belong to a new religion. So I was wondering if that's why there's this division, because while there are these accusations that Mary Cosby is running a cult, for some people they may look at it and think, well, it's still Christianity. It's something that they can... It's something that people can identify as being proper religion, in inverted commas, once again, because it's pre-existing, compared to a new religious movement that seems to be an entity of its own, for example. Is that part of this discourse?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think the debate part of it stems from a couple of things. I think some of it is also a lack of understanding, like you say, of the kind of more charismatic side of Pentecostal. And any type of Pentecostal that you go to has that very charismatic feeling if you kind of walk in and you feel things in your chest, when you're there. And I think a lot of people who are maybe more used to a quieter, more subdued and typically more white version of Christianity, because Pentecostal is typically very heavily present in the Black community, that they might find that very off-putting. I think there's also the issue of not being sure whether or not certain claims are accurate, because of the fact that they're all online. But it seems to be that more and more people are starting to come forward about certain things, but their claims are, I think sometimes, I don't want to say all over the place, because multiple claims that seem very different can all be true. But most of the focus on whether or not it is a cult is surrounding the conversation about finances. So it is that Mary Cosby is supposedly taking money from her participants, her people who are showing up, her congregants, and then using that in order to finance her very lavish lifestyle. So saying that they're collecting, say, money, saying that they're going to fix up the church, but the church building never gets fixed up, but then she's wearing lots of very high-end labels. So I think that's where a lot of the conversation tends to stem from. And I think, again, that ends up having a little bit of a weird conversation about what makes a religion abusive. Because when you talk about the word cult being typically associated with more abusive behaviors like Jonestown, where we can really, I think a lot of people can look at the history of what happened at Jonestown and say that's hard. That's a hard reality to look at.
Yeah, absolutely.
And say, therefore, that's that. But then when it starts being fuzzier, no one's life is threatened in Cosby's church, but their way of living is potentially threatened by the presence of the financial figure,
the fraud.
and so it becomes a bit iffier. But also, I mean, granted, when I was growing up and going to Christian churches, they were the quieter, whiter churches. But I don't know how anyone could afford Coach or Versace on anything that was being collected at that church. But granted, it was probably a smaller congregation from people in maybe a poorer area. I don't know how rich Salt Lake City typically is. But yeah, so I think it is a bit... those are the kinds of questions I think people have, is saying, well, people are saying this... How is she actually making her money? It is a bit iffy on how she makes her money. But
it's interesting, though, isn't it, that this tends to be a critique of Cosby, not the church.
Yes.
So would they still describe this church as a cult if it was with a different leader who didn't have these rumours surrounding them regarding fraudulent use of donations? I'm not expecting you to answer that question. That's purely
because that's all the conversation that I saw online was about the money. But in the trailer for the upcoming season, we see a clip of somebody saying that it's the reason why they're claiming it's a cult is because Mary says or claims that she is God. And then there's a following clip where Mary says that she doesn't think she's God. She's simply praying to the God within her.
But of course, when Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, that's not a cult at all.
Well,
I appreciate that's a very facetious comment, but that facetious comment comes from my lack of patience, I think, with the fact because this is a conversation that we've been having in the study of NRM since the 1970s. Sorry, I'm taking this on a tangent, but I'll get it out of my system.
No, go at it.
All religions were once new. All religions are social constructs. They all started from an initial group, and a lot of the accusations of cult, or I don't even want to say cult yet, a lot of the accusations of fake religion tends to come from, oh well, somebody made this up. Everyone made the religion up. It is a series of actions and practices by a certain group of people. Christianity was once new, and Christianity has beliefs that to people who are unfamiliar with them could seem strange. The resurrection, Jesus walking on water. But these beliefs are accepted. They're accepted because they have a dominance in society. It is not unusual to meet someone who believed that Jesus walked on water. It is unusual to meet someone who is a member of ISKCON or a Scientologist. And then that automatically creates this othering. And this is part of my problem. This is why I'm bringing the world religions paradigm up, in that this world religions paradigm of there being 5 or 6 religions has created a normative understanding of religion, that this is religion, and anything outside of this paradigm is other, is strange. And a lot of it comes down to this, is that you were just mentioning Mary Cosby being accused of spending money in places where she shouldn't be. Something you can see throughout the history of religion. Or Mary claiming to be God, something you can see throughout. These aren't aspects that are unique to new religions or unique to what people are describing as cults. The Vatican, for example, is sitting on an enormous level of money. All religions are concerned with money because they live in a neoliberal society. This is what I find quite fascinating about the conversation about what makes a real religion, and when it comes down to money, is that in terms of mainstream society, particularly in the West, neoliberalism has become the norm. Particularly, I'm thinking of the concept of capitalist realism from, I think, Mark Fisher, I think that's his name, where the idea of anything outside of capitalism now, or outside of neoliberalism, seems really strange, that you can't see anything else existing. This is how society works. And that's praised. The free market is generally praised. And we all live inside that. It's impossible to not live inside, you have to take part in neoliberalism to survive in this world. But when religions start doing that, that's seen as a step too far. Yeah. Because religion is seen as being something too ineffable almost. It can't be money. It's too important that it's a series of transactions. If a religion starts selling things, then that's a bad thing. But religions have always relied on donations, and they're going to. Because we live in this neoliberal... It is not unusual to see religions engage with neoliberal practices. But when it comes to new religions, the financial aspect plays a huge part in this accusation of it being a cult. And I'm not defending or accusing anyone here of using money in ways that are either right or wrong. I'm speaking about this as an outsider. But this is where the accusation of something being a cult completely falls flat. Because if we're going to go down that route that Mary Cosby claims to be a deity, that is such a common aspect of so many religions. Oh, Mary Cosby has taken money. Yeah, and I'm not defending her. I'm not accusing her either. I don't know enough about this. As in case our listeners haven't guessed, I haven't watched the show. I've seen some clips that Vivian has sent me. So I'm not making accusations or defending in any way, but this is hardly unusual throughout the history of religion. It is, and certain religions, because they are new or because they are other or because they are a minority, get hit with the criticisms even harder because they don't fit that normative understanding of what religion is.
Right. So I guess then the question that maybe someone else might have in this kind of would be, what do you use as a way to judge when somebody is, say, taking advantage for the sake of taking advantage?
Yes. Well,
because that obviously does happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is the other part that I was planning on getting to, actually, is the scholars of new religions are often accused of being cult apologists. where they excuse behaviours of certain groups for, to uphold this idea of a neutral category of a new religious movement. And I think that's an unfair criticism because the criticism tends to say, well, when these scholars see malpractice, they should condemn that. Well, yes, of course. Just like you do with any... The point that we're trying to make with the idea of a new religious movement is that when we start studying something, we don't immediately go in with this understanding of it being not a real religion. Of course it's a real religion, but that doesn't mean that it's a good religion or a bad religion. And then let's unpack those nuances further. Simply because one person involved with a new religious movement has engaged with with a seedy activity doesn't mean that others haven't. I often come back to the example of Catholicism because it's a really good one in that people are very well aware of the Vatican scandals and the instances of sexual abuse. And the role the Vatican has played in covering up some of that. And I often say to people, you wouldn't criticise an everyday Catholic for the actions of the Vatican. You wouldn't condemn someone who goes to their Catholic church once a week for the behaviours for something that the Vatican has done, in the same sense that you can't do that with somebody who's in a new religion. So what I'll say here is, if Mary Cosby is... Well, firstly, if she claims to be a god, who are we to say that she isn't? She could well be. I don't believe that she is. But we're going to go down value judgments there. If we're going to say, well, no, she clearly isn't, then what about every other religious figure who's claimed to be a prophet or a saint or even a charismatic leader with access to an esoteric knowledge? That's a whole rabbit hole in itself, isn't it? But if, for example, Mary Cosby is found to have fraudulently spent money somewhere, or is using church donations for her own, to buy lovely clothes and so on, that's a critique of her, not of the movement. That doesn't mean that other members of her church are brainwashed cult members. They have rather been deceived by somebody who is using the money for other motives. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I think so. I guess what it comes down to would be, is there any usefulness in having a term, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the word cult, but something like cult, where people are using it as a way to demonstrate that this religion is problematic, whether that be because they deceive their congregants, whether it be because they abuse their congregants. But is there any use for a word like that, in a sense where we can then have a conversation about it in that kind of sense without maybe necessarily condemning every single person who...
But the short answer is no. For me, others may disagree, but we can't use the word cult because it's got all sorts of connotations that people use in a different way. It's just no longer, it's not fit for purpose. It was quite commonly used in anthropological works in the 1800s, but now we're at a point where it's been thrown around too much.
Yeah, and I should say that the kind of more historical use of the word in both anthropology and sociology were always based on very kind of definitive factors of the group. Yes. So say the size of it and things like that, rather than on any kind of value judgment.
Well, it's the definitive aspect that I wanted to ask you about the question you just asked about, could we have a term for a religion that is problematic? Well, what do we mean by problematic? Because aren't all religions problematic one way or another? I think the problem is that people are problematic, and people do religion. This is something we've always been coming back to in this podcast, isn't it? Is that we're essentially studying people and what they do. So, people doing problematic people who do problematic things are always going to come into certain organizations or certain groups. to use the Vatican example again, there's an example of a highly problematic case in the Vatican that's been a large part of public discourse in recent decades. Does that mean we need to find a term other than religion to mean that we're discussing Catholicism? No, because there's so much more to Catholicism. There's everyday Catholicism. There's churches across the world with different understandings of what it means to be a Catholic. I feel like having one term, I guess this comes back down to how religion is a problematic term in itself anyway. Having one term is just far too convenient. There isn't enough nuance. This is why I simply use the word religion. And if we want to look at problematic instances, then we should just describe those problematic instances. So if somebody wants to say that Mary Cosby has this movement that, and they truly believe that she's doing, bad things, then they should direct their critiques towards her rather than simply saying, oh, well, she's part of this cult. It's just far too much of a blanket statement. In the same sense that somebody could get fired from a job. If somebody gets fired, if somebody gets fired from working in Tesco because they swore at a customer, then that's a critique of them. It's not a critique of the other staff who work there.
Yeah.
It's not a critique of Tesco as a whole. I don't know why I've picked this example.
Yeah, that seems like a weird one. I probably would have picked Amazon.
Yes,
people really don't like Jeff Bezos, but I don't have anything against the warehouse workers.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can criticize Jeff Bezos, but at the same time, that is a criticism of the individual. I think this is where we need to break down the idea of religion being an institutional category, which I find, I understand religion as something fluid. I try to approach religion from a horizontal perspective, not a vertical top-down perspective. So look at what everyday people are doing, and people do different things. So what Mary Cosby's doing could be completely different to another person of her church who is a genuinely good person and is helping members of their local community.
And I should just say, just for any lawyers of Mary Cosby's who might be listening, this is all allegedly.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've not even seen the show.
It would be a really great way to get this podcast on the map is to be sued by Mary Cosby, but let's not try it.
Yeah, no. I am not saying for a second that Mary Cosby has spent church money on these products or anything else that she's accused of. I don't know enough about the show, but what I do know is that these accusations don't necessarily make her movement a cult.
I think that what makes this example in the case study and watching the show, and I'd be interested to see how it all unfolds in the show and the conversation regarding it. We might have to have a follow-up if lots more comes out or something. But I think what's really fascinating about it is it being paired alongside Mormonism, who I think Mormonism is a religion that frequently has those exact same debates around it. There are people who really dislike Mormonism and who like to use the cult word to describe it, who really see it as a problematic new religion. And there are lots of people who really don't see Mormonism as being at all a problem. And it's a massive world religion at this point, Mormonism. And it's really interesting to see that kind of alongside the conversation about Mary Cosby, because it's happening essentially in the same show.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the question I wanted to ask you then, because you were saying about Mary Cosby's lawyers, and once again, we are not saying that she's done any of these things, and we are not, and if anything...
I don't know, I'm so sorry, it's all alleged.
Yeah, we're just discussing this discourse that is happening online. And if anything, some people may even accuse me of being an apologist here, because I'm saying that, no, she isn't in a cult. So no, we're purely outsiders discussing pre-existing discourse. But what about the show itself then? Because she's a willing participant in the show, isn't she?
Yes.
So how do you feel as a viewer of the show that I know this conversation is probably going to move on as the next season comes out, where there seems to be taking more of a center stage. But does the show seem to want to present this cult angle? Is she aware of this cult angle?
No, I think she probably wasn't quite aware of it until the show started airing and people... I mean, it's hard to say what she was aware of and what she's not, obviously. And I think there has been a lot of shady things in her life in general. Whether or not they are problems or not is a different matter for a lawyer to figure out, but they seem shady. So I'm sure she's used to people critiquing her on some level. But the show never presented the religion as something that was other, as something that was strange.
That's interesting. So that's happened outside of the show.
Yeah, there's a really interesting scene, and I think it was one of the ones that I sent you, where one of the other women, Whitney, her father was struggling with alcohol addiction and drug addiction, and he had just come out of rehab, and he was really struggling to find himself, and he used to be very religious, and so she decided to bring her father to Mary's church. And there's a scene so you get to really see Mary's church in action in this scene. And then you also have Mary kind of blessing, in a way, Whitney's dad to help him with addiction. And her dad is crying, and there's lots of emotion, and people in the audience are crying, and you have that big emotive feeling that you get with Pentecostal churches. And Bravo is a very interesting program when it comes to reality television shows and the editing process. They're very good at presenting things straight, but with a wink. And the Bravo wink is something that's discussed a lot on, just discussions around Bravo and how it works, where they present something, then they kind of wink in a way to go, yeah, we know this is ridiculous. Yeah, we know this is a bit silly. I didn't catch any winks when it came to the church itself. And the practices there, but that might be because I didn't necessarily see it as strange, because I'm used to much stranger religions than that and not finding those all that weird. So for me, a Pentecostal church is very normal. It's
world accommodating.
Yeah, it's very mainstream in a way, but I think in a way that maybe a lot of people aren't exposed to, especially not maybe very straight-laced white people who maybe not even don't go to church even. Some atheists might see a Pentecostal church as very strange and very weird. But maybe that's why I didn't pick up on the wink. For me, the Bravo winks were more focused on Mary as a person and more focused on the fact that she was married to her step-grandfather, because that's just a really great tag to get people to watch a show, is to say we have a woman who married her step-grandfather. And I think that was more of the pull than her religion.
And that's an unusual thing to happen in terms of societal norms.
Yeah.
See, a lot of this, all this conversation essentially just comes down to societal norms and what people are used to. You mentioned, very mainstream white people who may not even be religious may find this aspect really strange, but everything is strange if you're not familiar with it. That's the definition of the term.
There's a really great thing in anthropology, and I believe sociology kind of follows the same structured idea, is that the point of what we do is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar.
Absolutely.
So the whole point of what we do is supposed to see things that others might see as strange and recognize them for being familiar. What is it like when this is familiar to us? And then to also turn that lens backwards on the things that we take for granted, that we think about as very normal and very familiar, and to see them as someone who's newly coming in would see them. I know that there's probably a lot of things that I do that someone kind of newly coming into my life would probably go, what on earth are you doing? And I think that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy studying popular culture and doing deep dives like this that we've been doing this whole podcast on, because that's essentially what we're doing, is we're taking all those things that we would normally just watch and not think about and saying, no, actually, let's really consider this as if we weren't just sitting and watching this every single Friday night. What would we think about it?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's definitely, I think it's a motto that I think a lot of people should take into their life, no matter what they do. Even if you're not an anthropologist, I think you should seek to take everything that's strange to you and try to make it familiar to you, but also do the opposite.
Carol Cusack has previously applied that making the strange familiar and the familiar strange approach to Scientology with regards to celebrity Scientologists. And how the Church of Scientology has celebrity centers and even celebrity programs. Like, they like to nurture celebrities and attract celebrities, and part of that makes Scientology familiar to people. That the desirable lifestyle of someone like Tom Cruise and his recent 2 curries. He recently ate 2 curries and it made the news for some reason. But the desirable lifestyle of someone like Tom Cruise and somebody that you see so often in media doing Scientology makes it familiar for people, and that's an attempt to make Scientology commonly understood, and maybe even attract people to Scientology, to show people from the church's perspective why they should do Scientology. And it's a similar aspect here, that maybe speaking in tongues may seem strange to someone, or maybe a church leader claiming to be God will seem strange to someone, but that is your background. Maybe from another background it may seem completely reasonable. I'll always remember when I used to teach in schools, I taught Buddhism to a group of 13, 14-year-olds who were really struggling to grasp the idea of religion not involving God, the idea of reincarnation and of karma, because they had this very Western Christocentric understanding of what religion is. And someone said to me, oh, well, this is all just weird, isn't it? Which kind of makes me laugh that it's Buddhism they say is weird, given
I was about to say, we can really blow their minds, can't we?
Really blow their minds. But just to use this example, he said to me, oh, yeah, this is really weird. And I said, what do you do every Christmas? Just before Christmas time. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, what do you do with a tree? And he said, I decorate it. I said, so you put a tree in the middle of your living room and you put things on it to make it look nice. And just describing it in that kind of almost facetious, basic way kind of made him realize, oh yeah, that would seem really weird to somebody who's been raised in a society where that's never anything that they've done.
Yeah.
Something that's so important to remember in religion is that we come into religion with our preconceived notions. Even as academics, we do. Part of getting over that is acknowledging that we always have cultural biases. While we may strive for a neutral study of religion, or, a neutral study of new religions in this aspect, we are always limited by what we are familiar with. We're always limited by our backgrounds and how we interpret and react to things. But we just have to keep that in mind. And taking that step back, like we do with this podcast every week, is part of that process. Like, for example, culturally, Vivian and I come from different backgrounds. Vivian is from Florida in the US, and I'm from rural South Wales. And I'm sure, not that I can think of any instances right now, but I'm sure that there are everyday activities or even just ways of understanding the world that may jar Vivian or may jar me that wouldn't faze the other.
I mean, we've had a conversation about one of the things, which was that, granted it's the other way, is I think I told you about this when I was growing up, we would have to have drills for in case there was a gunman on campus at our school.
Gosh, yes.
And the idea, I was explaining this to you and our friend Theo at a time, and I could just see your minds just going like, but why? Like, Just the idea that being so, it was so ingrained in me this is just what you do and this is just part of it. And then I moved to a country where firearms are completely illegal. And the amount of small things that I've noticed over time that means isn't happening, or that I don't have to think about, or that isn't happening culturally, has been a really interesting thing to really dissect and pick up. And I always enjoy telling people in the UK about our drills, because it's so foreign of an idea to them.
Yes.
That as an elementary school kid, I was having to practice hiding under my desk, because that's just what you do.
That's terrifying. That was so terrifying. And even in the UK, being Welsh, and I live in England, and when I've had English friends visit my home, which obviously hasn't happened in a long time because of the pandemic, but when that has happened, they are always struck when they come into my living room and they see a wooden chair. And it's a wooden chair. It's carved, and it's got the Welsh 3 feathers on it, and it's got some Welsh writing, and my name is on it. And that chair it's a Welsh Eisteddfod chair, and it was made by my grandfather, who is a carpenter. And when I finished my masters, as a present to commemorate it, he very kindly and very generously made this chair for me. So it's very much a prized possession. Now, the idea of being given a chair as a prize in Wales is completely everyday. In Wales, we have an annual competition called the Eisteddfod, where people will enter. Schools hold an Eisteddfod themselves, and there is a national Eisteddfod for poetry, singing, instrumentals, various performances, and they're usually rooted in Welsh culture, one way or another. And part of that is that every year someone is awarded the Eisteddfod chair, and they will sit, and it's always a wooden chair, and it's decorated with maybe, say, Celtic symbols and so on, Welsh symbols. And to me, that's just completely everyday. And I have this chair, and it's a prized possession, of course. But of course, that's my Eisteddfod chair. But when I have friends visit who are English, just live 4 hours away from where I was raised, they see that and they go, "What's that?" It's my Eisteddfod chair. Why's it got your name on it? Why were you given a chair? But to me, it just makes complete sense. It's very beautiful as well. But we all... Sorry, I've gone on a complete tangent, but the point I'm making there is to show how something that you do in your everyday life could seem completely bizarre to another people. And the same goes with a religion that could exist on the other side of the world that you've never heard of, in a country that you've never heard of.
Yeah.
We have to avoid coming in with preconceived notions. And that is ultimately the problem with cultic discourse. It's essentially to say what Eileen Barker, who is the patron saint of new religious movement studies, what she's been saying for decades: a cult is simply a religion you don't like. If someone disagrees with the religion for a specific reason, or disagrees with the practice of a religion, they'll use the word cult, and ultimately all that means is they disapprove.
Yeah.
And if somebody disapproves, that doesn't mean they're right. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're not. Because, look at Islamophobic prejudice. That is somebody coming in with preconceived notions and a lack of understanding of what Islam is. And if they then end up describing Islam as a cult, then they are simply just saying that they don't understand it. That they don't like it. They may understand it, but they may not like it. And, Eileen's work, particularly in the 1980s, she did a study of the Unification Church where she debunked the brainwashing thesis. That has set the benchmark for NRM studies as it currently stands. But ultimately, she's right. That is what it comes down to.
That's fair. Now, I don't know when this is going to come out, but as you can tell, Aled knows quite a lot about controversial religions because he specializes in Scientology, which, as you can imagine, is very controversial.
Yes, has a history.
But he's going to be giving a talk on Free Zone Scientology.
Oh, yes. Good segue.
Yes. There is links to that through a talk series that is hosted by an organization that both Aled and I are a part of called ALTAC, which is alt-ac.uk. If you put that into your little browser window, you'll be taken directly to that website, and you can find all the registration details and timings and all of that kind of stuff. And if you're in a different time zone, because I know that we have very few listeners actually in the UK and many in other places, it will be available on those websites for a while afterwards, so you can watch it at a time more suited to you and your time zone. So yeah, go check that out. If people want to talk to you about that talk, as well as anything else that is going on, Aled, where can they go?
Oh, they can go to my Twitter page at AledJLL come find me on there. We can have a critical discussion of new religions and the limitations of cultic rhetoric. I mean, we had, just as a side note, we didn't even get on to how the term cult is currently weaponized in contemporary discourses surrounding vaccines or politics.
Oh, no, I feel like that's a whole nother episode, isn't
it?
It
is. So let's put a pin in that and come back to that, because that's the other part of the word cult that I have a problem with, is that it's now weaponized. Coming back to the point I made about people who may be Islamophobic and use the term, they're using it as a loaded, weaponized term. But sorry, Vivian, if people want to come and chat to you about the anthropology of religions, where could they find you?
You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally on TikTok. I'm going to get better at TikTok, I promise. But all three of those, I am at Vivian Asimos. You can just check on how my name is spelled. And you can also go to my website, which is incidentalmythology.com. And that's where I break down a lot of things on popular culture and mythology, because that's how I see popular culture. So, yeah, if any of that interests you, go check that out. Yeah. Go check out Aled's talk. I almost called you Tom.
You could have got away with it.
Jesus Christ, what is wrong with me?
You could have called me Thomas.
If you want to...
Yeah.
If you want to check out information on that or on Aled's upcoming talk, then go and check all of those things out. And I cannot wait to talk to you all about the next bit of popular culture and cult talks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bye.
Bye.